This podcast is sponsored by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com.
Welcome to Permission to Speak, the video blog and podcast that loiters at the intersection of leaders who want their people to speak up, technology that facilitates connections, and results that serve our higher purpose. Now, here's your host, Kelly Vandever.
Hi, this is Kelly Vandever. Welcome to the podcast. My special guest today is Natalie J. Sayer. Natalie has a very interesting background. In fact, she has traveled the world extensively, coaching leaders in English and Spanish, and she's helped them improve their daily lives, their businesses, and their results through better leadership and through lean. She's the founder of the Blair David Company, an Arizona-based leadership and organizational improvement consultancy, and she's a certified global executive coach. She has worked in 16 countries and managed multicultural teams. Her first expat assignment was at the age of 20. Natalie is a speaker and published author, and one of the things that she does talk about is this aspect, and the reason why I wanted her on the show today was to talk about helping people speak up when we are dealing with people from different cultures than what we grew up with. But she's a little bit of a unicorn. May I use that expression?
Absolutely.
Okay, because she has 2 engineering degrees and has been in 20 theatrical productions. You don't normally see engineer and theatrical in the same sentence. So we've invited her here today to share her thoughts about leading successfully in other countries and in other cultures other than your own, helping people be comfortable speaking up and navigating those nuances of cultural lives, whether in person or virtually. So welcome, Natalie, to the podcast.
Gosh, thanks, Kelly. I'm very excited to be here today.
Me too. All right, so we start, as you know, with a couple of quirky questions, and then we get into the more serious stuff. So my first quirky question for you is, tell us about your favorite guilty pleasure television show.
Well, the funny thing is I don't watch a lot of TV, but I would say recently True Blood, the whole True Blood series, because I not only read all of the books, I've watched all of the seasons, which were very different, but I would have to say True Blood.
Okay, then. All right. So she's got a little dark side to her then.
Or magical. I like to
think
of it as magical.
Magic. Okay, we'll go with that. All right. Tell us something surprising about yourself that most people don't know.
I played the tuba.
Well, that's not something I would have come up with. Is that recent or?
No, it was when I was a kid. I have an older brother who's a fantastic musician, and it was one of those, anything you can do, I can do better. Not really. When it came to the tuba. So I was going to be the first girl tuba player in the marching band, and then somebody beat me to it. So I ended my tuba career.
Well, thank you for sharing that with. Whoops, sorry, we lost you for a second there. Did you say something brilliant after your career ended?
No.
Okay.
No, just ended my tuba career.
Okay. All right. And our transitional question. So when was the first time you really got how important leadership is and what a difference it makes in the lives of people?
You know, it actually started at a very, very young age in grade school. But I'm not going to go back that far. I'm going to go back to that first expat assignment. Because I was assigned to work in Matamoros, Mexico. I never had Spanish. I didn't have any language, really. I had a year of Latin. Nobody speaks that anymore. Go figure. And I was assigned to lift truck repair. And in lift truck repair, there was only one person who spoke English. And I didn't realize, I was being me. I was, helping him kind of understand the differences of, when I hear him talk about frustrations, the differences of U.S. perspectives versus Mexican perspectives. At least I could share the U.S. part at that point in time. And, we helped each other. He helped me learn some Spanish. I helped him improve his English. I helped him look at a different perspective of why do we have 6 different brands of a certain lift truck, But I didn't realize I was leading. I was being Natalie, a 20-year-old working in lift truck repair, making the best of my assignment and trying to make improvements. And sometimes you don't know your impact. And a few years ago, so that was in 1985. I'm showing my age. In 2012, I believe it was, I get this Facebook request from Mario, and I'm thinking, the mental file is trying to get a name and a face with the first name and last name. And by that point in time, I'd done a lot of work in Latin America, in Mexico, in Spain. So I had a lot of, Spanish-based names in that mental file. And I was like, I'm like, from Matamoros? And he's like, yes, sunshine. And I'm like, I didn't think I'd ever hear from this person again. And he proceeded then to thank me. And I'm like, for what? And he said, you taught me things that helped me be more successful later on. You taught me how to look at things from a different perspective. You helped me with my English. And I was being me. And so I think we don't understand the power of how we show up in the moment and how that inspires people to speak up, to lead themselves as well. And so I would say, it's 1985 when concretely in another culture, I realized the importance. And I went in there knowing nothing. And sometimes that's good if you have the curiosity with it, to listen and to learn and to ask questions. And so especially when you are working with countries and cultures not your own. And if you're US based, it's so easy to be US centric, the old ugly American.
Right.
And because we, are a big business leader, or we assume that because the language of business is English, that everybody understands exactly what you mean. Well, I just did this online quiz yesterday of how well do you speak Australian? And I got a 7 out of 10, and I thought I spoke Australian a whole lot better than I evidently do. I got to study up. So even when, there's a common language assumption, even, separated the whole Oscar Wilde quote, I think it was, of separated by a common language.
Yeah.
It's magnified when the people you're interacting with, their native language isn't the same as yours.
Right. So you ended up in this position at a very young age, and did you become drawn then to more global type experiences, or how did you end up working in so many different countries and with different cultures? Is it a natural inclination or
I would say it's a natural inclination, because at that point in time, you could go to Portugal or you could go to Mexico. There were only 4 people selected. And I'm like, oh, this sounds like an awesome opportunity. It gets me some international experience. It gets me some plant experience. But I've always been curious. I can remember in 3rd grade, there was a film strip called Mexicali Soup, about a different culture. In high school, I was the one hanging out with the exchange students or active in AFS. And so while I couldn't in high school be an exchange student, I've just always been fascinated by other countries and cultures, but particularly drawn to South America, Mexico, Spain, some of the Western Europe stuff. Although I've had the opportunity to travel in what used to be some of the Eastern Europe countries too. Asia, haven't gotten there yet. Behind me there's a map, and on that map are places I've been, places I want to go, places that scare me, so I better go. One of those kinds of things.
Nice.
And it's just so I have sought out those opportunities, but I also have found myself, and I think it could be my personality, but I also think it's a great leadership quality to have, is that understanding and wanting to be a translator or a help so that the whole is successful. Because the parts can get disconnected. You can't have a complete jigsaw puzzle if the parts don't fit.
Right. Well, and maybe that leads us kind of into the next question. You were kind of naturally drawn to it. I feel like it's an important topic to talk about, dealing with folks that grew up in different cultures than you. But why would you say it is important, or for some of the leaders that might be listening?
Even if you grow up in small town wherever, We are global. The internet, we have global connections at our fingertips. And, whether you're, with all the outsourcing that's happened in the last 20, 30 years, the expansion into different, whether you're in the apparel industry, there isn't really an industry that hasn't been touched by some other country. We're not isolationist. Communications, the technology have connected us so much, but disconnected us in the same time. Yeah. And you can assume that you're on the same page, but you might not be. One other thing around how I got to be global, my dad he worked for General Motors, and he was assigned at one point in time in sales to set up joint ventures. And so when I was in 8th grade, he started traveling. And I'd get to see the slideshows. And I'm like, I want to be able to travel like that. I want to be able to work like that. I want to be able to know places, go places, know people. And, I'd like to think I'm a global citizen, but I know I'm not there yet, because when I look at other people who are like always gone. But my path, the curiosity has always been there.
Very cool.
So for leaders, whether you are contracting somebody on Fiverr to do a graphic and they are out of Bangladesh, or you are assigned to a tech team, I have people, Intel is here, and, you go to Intel and you see all people from all over the places of the world making things happen. So understanding end users, who are the user group? It could be somebody from not where you are.
Right. So I know we have listeners that are from 5 different continents. For some reason, I have not cracked South America yet. Maybe you can help me with that. Nobody from South America, but we have 5 continents. That's pretty good. But most of our listeners are in the U.S. So folks, forgive me in advance if I skew a little American. I don't mean to be an ugly American, honest, but so what have you found most helpful in trying to open up communications with somebody who maybe wasn't born in the same culture that you were from? What have you found to be some helpful tips and techniques?
So I actually, before I go to tips and techniques, I want to come back a little bit and go some philosophy. Okay. I believe that we are leading at 3 levels all the time. We have to lead ourselves. We lead or influence others, lead or influence some kind of organization, product, project. So we're always leading at 3 levels, right? You're leading self, leading others, leading the business. Let's just use the term the business to cover that 3rd level. And so it starts with you. It starts with, am I excited about this opportunity? Do I resent it? Am I scared? Am I concerned? What do I have that I can leverage? How good of a listener am I? Am I curious about this place? Am I willing to do some research? Now, research sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. I've got a story for that later on if you want that. But it's really about understanding you in the context of the situation that you're in. And that's whether you're working with other cultures or not. That's very useful to understand. Sometimes we get so focused on that 3rd level that we forget the self, the others, and then the project or the work.
Gotcha.
So some of the tips are, to get very concise on tips, is understand you, understand your biases. There's assessments that you can take. There's one that I like called the Cultural Orientations Index. And the Country Navigator is another. But the more that you can understand yourself, the more then you can understand and relate. Do you fall into stereotypes? Do you believe that a certain culture is, let's talk about time, right? They always lose track of time. Tomorrow doesn't mean tomorrow. Or, the trains run on time. They're very time rigid. And if you understand where you are in that continuum and who you're working with, or maybe on the same team, you have people that are both, right? You have people that are far more relationship oriented, and time, time is time. I want to first trust you and relate to you before I jump into the work. And you might have the same, on that same team, people that want to jump into the work. And, that's all, getting to know you stuff is a bunch of crap. So knowing yourself and how you relate to, where you are with the people that you're going to be working with, and then understanding who you're working with. So, my husband always likes to say food and culture bring people together. I can tell you, one of the first times I was in Mexico, I'd never seen a tamale before. Now, if you know a tamale, you know it is this masa and maybe a sweet or savory filling, and it's wrapped in a corn husk. You don't go on the corn husk, which I was about to do, and everyone was like, no! And guess what? I felt so stupid. So when you're working with places that aren't your natural culture, expect to make mistakes. You know, learn especially if you're going to the place, learn some phrases. You know, learn some things about pop culture. You know, there's when my dad started doing international work, there was no internet, right? You know, it was far more formal. Someone would pick you up. Someone would take you around. You would be introduced. You weren't eating on your own. And now none of that formality exists unless you're at a very high level of an organization. So, you know, he was fit to be tied when he found out that his little girl was going to be traveling, you know, overseas, didn't know anybody, was going to be driving the first place she hit the ground, you know, and so it's a very different travel experience now. So the more informal experiences you can get, you know, have a passport. Let's start there. What's that statistic on the number of Americans that have passports? I think it's gone up now, but it's very low. It's low double digits of people that have passports in America.
I did not know that.
Yeah. I don't have the actual statistic with me. I should have looked that up beforehand. I didn't know it was going to come up.
It's okay. There's no quizzes. There's no. So you mentioned, you know, doing your research and that there are stereotypes that people have of different people from different cultures. So how do you balance doing that research versus, you know, stereotyping versus the individual themselves, those other folks that you're meeting with?
So what I have found most successfully when you're going into a situation is, first and foremost, look at the people as people and try to look beyond. It's like, I'm doing work with Kelly. I'm not doing work with Kelly the American from Georgia, right? So, or, you know, wherever you are, I believe you're in the South.
Yes.
So, you know, even in your own country, you have biases. You know, I can think of some biases about people from the South. You know, I can do that in several different countries. You know, there's this north-south thing, you know. And so so first and foremost, be aware, so create some awareness in you, but look at the person as the person first. Understand, you know, there is some value in getting to know the person. And it might not be natural for you, but that curiosity and empathy then create connection, and that connection builds trust. And, you know, the other thing is, you know, on the research, so there's one thing with the people, but then there's the business and business practices. You know, there are, you know, okay, let's go US centric. On the, you know, legitimately, publicly, we don't accept bribes. We don't, you know, do payola. So if you go into another country, and we aren't necessarily gift-giving culture, you know, it's not expected that you show up with a gift to do business. Well, if you go to a lot of other places in the world, that is an expectation. And that can break trust if you don't understand that. You know, you know, you won't get things done in certain countries if there isn't a payoff, if you will. So how can you navigate that cultural difference and still be true to the company policies, the ethics, the demands, etc.?
How do you do it? How do people work in that?
Sometimes they work through the locals, you know, getting to know your trusted advisors in the local place is important. You know, my policy is you don't do it. So, you know, for me to sit here and go, yeah, and then you have a suitcase full of cash to pay off some warlords, you know. I think you really have to just negotiate with a local person to say what is expected, what's the limit, how can we accommodate this but also accommodate that, and start collaboratively problem solving with it.
Okay. Now you had mentioned that there was a mistake you had made researching before you went to somewhere. Yeah.
So the first time I went to Colombia, we were meeting with a high-level consultancy there, and these people are in with the Minister of Economics, and that's another thing with smaller countries. You may have access into places and people that in the States, because we're so vast, you might have at a local or state level, but you probably don't have at a federal level. And so, these are heads of countries, and we were meeting with all of the top media to announce this potential partnership. And, the idea of that time it was about Six Sigma. And so I'd done all my research. I had met some people on a bus I was on vacation the week before we were leaving, and I had met some people on a bus coming back from Bouchard Gardens. I heard Spanish, and I'm like, oh, I get to practice. And I'm like, de dónde? And where are you from? And we started talking, and they happened to be from Bogota, and I was going to Bogota the next week. So I got a little information from them, and, because in the States, okay, let's talk stereotype, and then I'll get into the research piece. When I think of Colombia, I think of Pablo Escobar and the FARC and all the drugs, and it's not safe to go to. And, there are places that are probably less safe, just like there are in the States. But as a whole, I loved Colombia. I loved the people. I loved the places that I was. But I wasn't in the jungles. That's not a place that I was going. So my research said that Colombia is a far more formal business environment, that women wear skirted suits, not pantsuits, that, it's very, high level of protocol. By nature, I'm a very informal person. And so I got my ducks in a row. I went and bought suits that were skirted suits. And, got my wardrobe together. Because sometimes those details, there's some cultures that if you can't manage the details, like polishing your shoes, they'll notice that, and that'll be a deal breaker. So I show up in my beautiful new skirted suit, ready to go and be all official, and everyone from the media, from the consultancy, every female in the room was dressed business casual. And so I stuck out like a sore thumb. And so, had I had a better local contact at that point in time, I could have, but I was on the trip. I wasn't organizing the trip. I was on the trip. So I didn't have that direct local contact to ask the girl questions, right? Which aren't really girl questions, but, what is appropriate attire?
Right. So having that local connection.
Having a local connection is really important. Now with LinkedIn, that was before LinkedIn. Now you have, okay, who do I know who knows something about Colombia?
Right.
And can give me more updated, because I had gone to the newspapers. I tried to scour what I could see in the business section. That sometimes there just isn't enough information. And so you go in, you do your best. And when you realize you've worn totally the wrong thing, it's like showing up at a Halloween party in a costume when no one else is there.
Right.
And you have to roll with it. So
right.
Resiliency as a leader is especially in contexts that you're not normally in, that just forgive it, move on, and figure it out. Learn how to laugh at yourself is an important characteristic, again, at that leading yourself level.
So is laughing at yourself a fairly universally accepted kind of good sense of humor type of thing? So I think in the U.S., if we're able to laugh at ourselves, we think that's healthy, to be able to say, I look silly, and be able to laugh at that lobster suit you showed up to at the costume party. But is that a universally kind of human thing, that it's okay to laugh at yourself?
So I don't have statistics and data, so I'm not going to purport that, yes, statistically speaking, this is a wonderful thing. In my experience, maybe it looks different, but that self-acceptance, rather than laughing at yourself, but that self-acceptance and that humility, so more in a Japanese culture, you would need to save face. So you might need to apologize. I'm so sorry that I disrespected you. It wasn't intentional, versus, in the States, you're like, oh man, that was so stupid. Language is important as well. So, I'm going to laugh at myself. That might be slang or jargon that people don't understand.
Right.
And that's another thing. You have to be much more deliberate in your communications when you're leading and acting in other places. And you would not, I was facilitating this leadership process in English and in Spanish. And when we were translating the English into the Spanish and trying to get a Spanish that would be understandable and acceptable in all of the different places, you get into slang, right? You get
Right.
into a word here means something totally different over here. Sometimes it means something inappropriate. So, learning, but the training material was full of jargon and slang and expressions that were unique to the training program, that when you start translating in another level, it's how do you make the intent understood when the words probably don't make sense at all.
Right, right, right. So that's always going to be an
Yeah.
issue then.
Yeah. And when you're leading teams, let's say your team, leading self, leading team, leading others, and leading the business. Let's say the business results aren't what you want, and you have to have some kind of corrective conversation with your team. It depends on who's on that team on how that's going to go, and what the best way and most effective way is. And is the answer and the response that you perceive from them really the answer and response that you're giving? When I worked in Mexico, as an engineering manager, starting up manufacturing plants. When I arrived, this was later in my career, and when I arrived there, I had, a little bit of conversational Spanish. I did not have technical Spanish. I didn't, so I had 17 people that didn't speak English. One kind of had just gotten back from an immersion process. So we had to figure out how to communicate. And, so one of the stereotypes around Mexicans is mañana. Mañana never comes. Mañana nunca viene. So, it's like, when are you going to get this done? Tomorrow. Tomorrow Thursday, or tomorrow whenever, Or, will you be able to get this done? Yes. Because they're never going to tell you no. So did they say, yes, I'll have it done by Thursday? Or did they say, yeah, yes?
So how do you
There's two different ways.
right? And so how do you manage that kind of? Well, I assume at some point you may not even realize that that's an expectation that you have. That when somebody says it'll be done Thursday, it'll be done Thursday, and that's
Yeah.
the way that our culture has brought us up. So how do you deal with that, and then how do you try to get on the same page so that when somebody says Thursday, it's Thursday, or that it's not
Yeah.
Thursday, it's a week Thursday, or
So that's when you go back to leading yourself, right? So first off, what are your expectations and what are your biases? If you are dealing with a homogeneous team that's not, so in that case, I was dealing with an all Mexican team, then it was me recognizing, okay, there's a stereotype that exists here. And when you look at dimensions of culture, you think about, time, you think about communication, is it direct or indirect? You think of, is it a hierarchical organization, or Americans are very individual? Are you a high context communicator where you're looking for everything around? Or are you direct, low context, which is just listening to the words? So that knowing yourself and knowing how you operate from a cultural standpoint, that's why things like the COI are super informative, then you know how you relate. So if I know that I am very time driven and I'm very future focused, but I'm also high context, I know that I can ask a question, say, okay, it is important that we have this deliverable done by Thursday, the 25th, I think the date is. Because, part of the leadership communication is what's important and why. Because, the client is counting on this. Because if we shut the assembly plant down, it's $1 million an hour. Because, so it's my job as a leader to say, okay, so then you follow up with questions like, what is it going to take for you to deliver this? You might start with, will it get done? And then you probe deeper of, okay, how are you going to get it done? What's your plan?
mm-hmm.
That's just good management. But knowing that there's that extra filter, that extra layer of a time stereotype, or not the same, meetings. I was facilitating this one session, and it was a high executive level of a company in Mexico. And it was completely okay to roam in and out of the room, to be on their phones half the time, to not really listen to what was going on, and yet they were complaining about ineffective meetings, decisions not getting made, So the outcomes were contrary. And there was one gentleman in there that happened to work for a German company before. And so then it was, probing delicately of, okay, what was it like when you worked in this company? What were meetings like? We were stand up. They had an agenda. It was a tight agenda. They started on time. They stopped on time, and they lasted no more than 20 minutes, and decisions were made, right? Okay, so here is a Mexican individual working in a German context that was successful. And so it was, what if this is where we are, and the problem with the business is our meetings are ineffective and we are not making decisions and people aren't showing up with their part of the work prepared. What are you willing to do as a team to change that? What behaviors are you willing to modify? What ground rules are you willing to put in place? And then that's not imposing your opinion of, better have a damn agenda and, all this stuff, pardon for the swear word. But it's then as a leader, you're more probing, but it requires you to become self-aware and to be curious.
So you're focusing on the business outcomes is one way to help guide that conversation, the why behind what you're asking.
Correct.
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay.
So, if you think of it as it's at the three levels, right? It's, okay, I know where I am and I know what my biases are. I know there's stereotypes that I believe, I don't believe. I'm going to try to see this team as individuals, learn about them, find out what experiences we can leverage. So let's say you have a new software team that, you're trying to get a new software product together. You have people from 6 different countries trying to do it. It's mainly going to be used in a US context. So, when you're thinking about that group of people, you need to understand, who are they? What are their biases? What are their strengths? Where are risks in, behaviors and risks in past performance? So, understanding things like what made you successful in the past time when you've been on other projects, how did you guys perform as far as your deliverables, time, money, budget, resources? And so then, if you're leading a project, then that gives you, okay, my outcome needs to be this. These are the people that I'm working with. Here's some behaviors. So it's like investing some time up front.
Right.
And using the culture conversation and this, how do I bring this group of people together most effectively? And are there some cultural things that could get in the way? So often we don't bring culture. And sometimes the word diversity is used, but diversity in the United States is not generally used first and foremost as we're working cross-culturally and how can that affect the business. There was one, and sometimes you're working in the same place, right? So we were working with a leader who was in the financial industry on Wall Street, and he had been here for 25 years, and he was Chinese by birth orientation, but in his mind, he was an American. He went to school here. But there was an observation with his peers that he's not a leader. Well, he was leading in the context of a Chinese leader. So, it would have been awesome if we could have gone both ways and worked with the New Yorkers. Because, okay, a New York Wall Street, this is another thing, Culture can be not only national culture, but there's a company culture and there's professional cultures. Right. So when I say New York Wall Street trader, stockbroker, that's a completely different image. What do you think when you say that? Like, how would you describe that person?
That's like a real driver. It's a real high energy. Yeah.
Exactly. Right. I'm going to run over you. And so, they were finding him not confrontational enough but that he didn't realize he was leading from his context of a leader. And, I believe the studies have shown 3 generations before truly you become the new context of leader. But now I haven't seen new research that's talked about now with this global connection that we have. Think of how much more connectivity we have in the last 10 years. iPhones have been created since then. The social media,
Right.
Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Periscope, Pinterest, all of those, Skype was kind of, sort of, but, look at how Skype is being used now.
Right.
And so, our technology is bringing us a lot closer, but it can also cause us to create a lot of assumptions.
Right.
And so I think that's one thing as a leader, it's important that you aren't making assumptions about the situation. So that's why it's important to be empathetic. It's important to be curious. And it's important to be clear about what are the business outcomes that we need to deliver, and how do we, as this group of people from all different experiences and perspectives, be able to deliver it. I was on a software team, and we were at the very beginning of concepts. So trying to get user requirements and all of that stuff. And our team, about 4 months into it, and it was had some diversity to it, looked at me and said, "We're broken, fix us." Because as a team, we were frustrated. We weren't seeing the progress they wanted. 80% of the group felt like we weren't making any progress. And when we used a different assessment, that one wasn't cultural based, but it was more team based. We found that we had a team of implementers, but we weren't in the implementation phase of the project. We were in the conceptual phase. So we've got all these, thoroughbred racehorses that are just want to run, and they're stuck in the gate or trying to get loaded in the gate, So sometimes as a leader, there could be a cultural element to that, but there could be also just a team dynamic situation in there.
Yeah. Well, going back to the cultural aspect of things, do the same rules apply? We were talking a lot about you going to other countries and dealing with folks in their own country. Do the same principles apply when you are here in the U.S. or in your home country if you're listening from another continent? And when you're dealing with somebody from another culture that's in your country that you grew up in, do the same principles apply?
Yes, and I think one of the assumptions that gets put in there is, you are in my country, you should behave like me, right? And so watching that bias doesn't creep in, or people who are tangential to the team that are just forming opinions about the team or the individuals, so if you are that person going into the other place, it's kind of your responsibility to try some of the food, listen to some of the music, get to understand the cultures and customs, learn how to acclimate, because especially if you are transitioning to be an expat, being an expat is a whole other conversation. There's a whole lot around being an expat and being an expat successfully, especially if you aren't the only one going on the assignment. You have kids, you have spouses or whatever. But you have some responsibility to be, again, you want to be curious, you want to be empathetic, you want to listen, you want to observe, and you want to make connection. I worked with an American guy who wore 2 hearing aids. So, from his time in the war, and he couldn't hear very well, and learning Spanish was almost impossible. But he learned a few phrases, and his personality and his connection and how he taught, he became a teacher. So there was a respect that was developed with people. If you come into any situation as a know-it-all, and I don't care if it's cultural or not, what happens? What have you observed, Kelly?
Most people don't love know-it-alls, let's just say.
Yeah, exactly. And so sometimes, the first time I was going to do that solo trip, the boss that I was working for had been to those places, and he thought it would be really important for me to be successful on this trip if I knew the location of every McDonald's in every town I was going to. I was going to Spain and Italy and, the UK, they're not necessarily known for their food, but they've got some really good pub food and curries, and Germany. So in those places, why would I ever, I don't really eat at McDonald's here. So, but he thought he was being helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you show up in these countries that are known, I've done a lot of travel to Peru, and maybe I'll try to hook some of my Peruvian friends into our podcast here. And I love Peru. I love the people of Peru. I love the food of Peru. It's very different. But it's funny, invariably, every time I was in maybe 10, 12 times in Peru, and I would have a car service pick me up and take me to the location where the training was going to happen. And every single time the driver would ask me, "Is this your first time in Peru?" And I would say yes, or I would say, "Why no?" And he goes, and if you said no, he goes, "Do you know about our food? Or, what do you think of our food?" And if you said yes, I've never been to Peru. They go, "Well, let me tell you about the food." So because the part of Peruvian culture is the food. They have a beautiful cuisine. As proud as the French are of their cuisine, the Peruvians are proud of their cuisine, and it's different, and it's interesting, and it's fabulous. And there are some things that, like in the American culture, not really my thing.
Right.
Don't really want to eat liver and onions. But being open and understanding, and you learn that through listening. After the third person to pick me up, to and from. So I'm not even the second trip in, the halfway into the second trip. I realized how important the food was in Peru. Did I know that going into it? No.
Gotcha.
Do I now have a Peruvian cookbook? Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Very
Yeah.
cool.
So, music and food are always cool entries.
Definitely.
Or entrees into a culture.
Definitely. Well, just looking at my list here, and we talked about a lot of things, but one thing I'm curious about: is it possible? Is everybody able, from your experience, of course, but to be straightforward in their communication? Is there a line that happens that everybody will speak up at some point if they're pushed far enough or whatever? Because I hear of some cultures that they're not willing to speak up.
Well, and from a speak up standpoint, your choice of words is very American, to be pushed to speak up.
Yes.
Right? So just even being aware of the language that we're using, in some cultures, I believe that if trust is created, and trust happens at different speeds in different cultures, right? So I believe, do I have data and evidence? No. But my experience in working in all of these different places is that if you create trust, then you create a doorway for them to walk through. How you get them to speak up is inviting them through questions. So if you ask the right question, or even say, I sense that you're not very happy at the moment. I don't know if there's something going on here at work or if there's something going outside of work. But what I'm seeing in your work performance is this. Is there something that we can do to change that? Or what are you observing in the team? Well, if you're in a culture that it is very, they might not do it in public, but they might do it in private. So if the culture is very safe face, that the boss is always right, then you're going to work harder to be able to find the formula or find the magic combination to draw that person out. But it starts with trust. And if I'm just going to go in and we don't have time for that. Well, you don't have time not to do it.
Right. Good. So I'm sure that if I was I have worked with people from other cultures, but always here in the U.S. And I'm sure I've probably made some mistakes. But let's say our folks listening know that they've made some mistakes, or they're going on a new assignment and are worried that they're going to make some mistakes. How do we recover from those? What's some advice you have there?
So the first is you have to forgive yourself. You got to accept it and go, okay, I screwed up. And then figure out, okay, how do I correct it? It's just like here, but it's slightly different because you might need to understand, so that local connection, so as I was trying to bite into a tamale with corn husks, I had somebody kind of save me before I like right here. And I tell you, I was mortified. I was so embarrassed, I really didn't even want to eat for the next 30 minutes. But I knew I had to. So, um, you just have to work through it. So being gentle with yourself, that sounds kind of maybe woo woo, but just going, you know what? Screwed up.
Yeah.
It's okay. Now, who do I know that can help me through this? So, I was facilitating, again, an executive group, and this one guy just pushed back. He goes, "You just don't understand Mexican culture." Because we had made the agreement as a team that we were going to start and end on time. And I had spoken about, okay, we are violating the agreement that we together made. And, he became offended. And so, I had to have an offline conversation, and because then I got defensive, right? So when you recognize those defensive cues, like,
Right.
Again, so knowing yourself, like recognizing yourself is huge. Again, especially when you're dealing with others. And so I was like, yes, I do. And so I had to really catch myself and go, okay, Juan, I hear you. I understand. And in the context of our training, we made this agreement. So how do you think we can honor the culture and honor our agreement so that together we can collectively move forward rather than, always having to fight this issue? And if we could solve this issue here, make progress here, your business complaint over here is, again, ineffective meetings, people coming in whenever they want. So, if we could practice that here, what's possible outside of here in your business? So can you recover? Absolutely. What do you need to do? Forgive yourself first. Recognize if you're becoming defensive. And, again, take a step back. Sometimes you have to leave the situation. And then find a connection or a confidant. Sometimes you blow it and you never get a new chance, right? So, there was when we were starting to do business with the Japanese, there was a team of Japanese purchasers, executives that were coming in to evaluate an operation for business. And one of them went into the restroom, and the American company had prepared and prepared and prepared. They had their presentation, they were ready, and the guy came out of the restroom and said, "We're leaving." And they were like, "What?" And he said, "Your window's cracked in the bathroom." This was through an interpreter. If you can't manage your own details, how can you manage the details of our business?
Wow.
So when people say culture doesn't really matter, or maybe it could have been more effective if I had a little more experience about the culture. No, from a business standpoint, you're leaving money on the table. And sometimes that money is not ever recovered. I don't think they ever got a chance with that company in that context again.
Wow. So important
So,
stuff.
the culture really is
Yeah.
important. So if you're trying to go after other business, understanding what are you dealing with? We can all go global. You have the technology. It is not very difficult to sell around the world. And then from a business standpoint, so there's not only the managing the people piece, but when you start looking at leading the business, then there's all of the legal implications and visa implications and customs and tariffs and taxes and laws and business practices. And so being open and willing to learn is a great characteristic as a leader, but especially if you're leading in contexts that aren't your own.
Perfectly.
And there's going to be people listening to this going, "That's too much work." Okay. But just know you're leaving stuff on the table.
Exactly.
When you do that. Okay. So that's a jargon, leaving it on the table. What does leaving money on the table mean? It means that I am, because of my behaviors, my decisions, my choices, my actions, I am not making as much money or leveraging my resources as effectively as I could potentially.
Right.
Leaving money on the table. Jargon.
For anyone who is listening that isn't familiar with that particular American saying. All right. Well, before we wrap up, and I'll ask you in a moment if there's any other thoughts you want to add to the conversation, but what have been one or two of the pleasant surprises that you've run into as you've been on this journey and learned more about culture and the global effect of things? One
of them is just in traveling overseas in general. it never ceases to amaze me when I'm scared or when I'm stuck or when I'm really unfamiliar about something, someone shows up and helps out. That has, that's been one of the wonderful things. I've had really good travel experiences. And I've met amazing people along the way. And the other surprise in doing this kind of work is what I'm capable of as a person. You learn a lot about yourself by travel. And so through learning about others, you learn about yourself. And, opportunities to grow, opportunities to learn, opportunities to make different choices, to explore new places. When you're in a place where you don't really recognize the alphabet and you don't speak the language, that's kind of scary. It can be very intimidating. There's a lot of people possibly listening to this that have been in that situation. Mm-hmm. And so it's, you can do this. You have the ability to lead cross-culturally. You have the ability to lead yourself, to lead your, lead others and lead your business. And I'm just going to go back to the story that we started with. You never know when the impact you have by just showing up open-minded, curious, and in a exchange of idea mode and in a learning, questioning mode, not interrogation, but curious. There's a big difference. You never know when you impact somebody's lives and career.
Very nice, very nice. Well, any final parting words of wisdom or recommendations that you might have for the listeners that are the leaders that are listening in?
I talk a lot about, there are resources, so explore things like if you're going into a circumstance like this, try to get a country navigator or a cultural orientation index or some kind of assessment so you get intel on yourself. Mm-hmm. So you can figure out how you show up. Some of these, like the COI, you can take that and then compare it on how the standard profile of that place you're going compares. So you can have a little bit of intel of, okay, I know I'm extremely informal and I'm going to Japan where I have a protocol on how I have to hand over my business card. So look for ways to get some intel on yourself. I have a lot of books that I've read. There's one by Bob Rosen on global literacies. There's Being Global, How to Think, Act, and Lead in a Transformed World. That's by the guy that was the head of Thunderbird. If you're getting ready to go to a place, while it's not 100%, they're always updating, kiss, bow, and shake hands. It just gives you a little bit of the etiquette and protocol. So, and then the internet, now you can pretty much, before you go to a place, get some headlines, look at the online newspaper. You can get it or translate it into English and you can kind of get a gist of what are they dealing with in that country right now. Like if you were to have to go to Italy right now, yesterday, they had a major earthquake that demolished some cities in the central area and it was only about 100 miles from Rome. And so also tap into your LinkedIn, somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. And so, really kind of look at this as lead yourself, lead others, lead the business. What is it you're there to do? Who are you doing it with? And how do you interact? So it's that, they used to call them soft skills. Recently, I heard the term essential skills. And in getting people to speak up, that is really around how do you interact and connect and catalyze people so that they feel safe to speak up. And, there's tools and technology. Okay, I was in Italy. Everybody's like, oh, you speak Spanish, you'll be fine. So, we're sitting there with Google Translate going, having the conversation with technology in the middle of it. And, in order to hit a higher purpose when you're looking at cross-cultural, multinational type companies, it's really understanding, how do you do that? How do you achieve the organization's purpose, the people's purpose, when you're dealing with that extra dimension of of culture.
Very good. Very good. Well, Natalie, thank you so much for sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. So appreciate it. And I'll definitely put connections in the show notes to anybody that might want to reach out and find out more about Natalie and the global coaching pieces of it, and the books that you referenced, and the assessments you referenced, and all the great information you provided. So
great. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Take care. Bye-bye.
This podcast was brought to you by Bigger Brains, online training that won't bore you to tears. Expand the minds of your workforce at getbiggerbrains.com. Thanks for tuning in to Permission to Speak. If you want to increase collaboration and innovation in your organization, check out more resources available at speakingpractically.com, or give me a call, Kelly Vandever, at 770-597-1108.